Um, this is the second time that I'm talking to students of you. But this is the first time that I seem to be on the opposite side of Professor Harry Roque, who was a student of my dad in UNILO. Okay. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not yellow, nor red, nor peach. I'm a long-time observer and reporter on how our three branches of government work. I base my conclusions on my own findings, and I'm a citizen of this republic. My thesis on the Supreme Court ruling on the Disbursement Acceleration Program, or DAP, have been interpreted by some as a desecration of the 1987 Constitution, a gross misrepresentation of the separation of powers, which is the very essence of our democracy, and a denigration of the congressional power of the first. Some law students and lawyers in particular, except for Professor Harry Roque and some others, have been quite virulent in their attacks of me. Shocked, but at the same time curious, I decided to find out why. Here's what I learned. Every law student's head is drummed with the principle of separation of powers as the very essence of our democracy. You'd probably say, of course it is. Why does she even have to mention it? It's a given. Yes, it's a given. A given that needs to be clarified. And it is not clarified when law students behave as if they alone are custodians of a sacred writ not meant to be discussed by impertinent, ordinary mortals, non-lawyers. Let me just quote from the late University of the Philippines President Vicente Cinco in his seminal book, Philippine Political Law, where he discusses the separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. I brought some props. Kasi I couldn't put it in a slideshow. Okay. This is the book of Professor UP President Cinco. Cinco said, he discussed in his seminal book, Philippine Political Law, the separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. Cinco said, each is not lower or higher than the other in the manner of a hierarchical system. It is rather coordinate and co-equal with the others, just like what Professor Harry Roque said. Cinco was writing about the 1935 Philippine Constitution, but the doctrine still holds for our current Constitution. Cinco said the underlying reason for having such a balance of powers was to prevent the abuse of authority. Cinco said this: the separation of powers has been criticized as a stumbling block to efficient government. He said, the criticism has practical merits. He gave us an example how this doctrine hampered the government's ability to cope with the devastation of a typhoon. He said, under such circumstances, when prompt action is imperative, the principle of separation of powers becomes a positive deterrent to the protection of public interests, for which the government is precisely organized. But he said this admitted disadvantage is considered a lesser evil than the probability of an autocratic authority, meaning a one-man group. In the impressive words of Justice Brandeis, Cinco wrote, the doctrine of separation of powers was adopted by the American Convention of 1878 not to promote efficiency but to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power. The purpose was to save the people from autocracy. No wonder many lawyers and students were mad at me. They like to believe I'm backing the establishment of a dictatorship. I am not. They forgot another aspect of the principle of separation of powers. Cinco articulated that aspect when he said that there are instances when the Constitution does not furnish a clear guide for determining whether certain powers are legislative, judicial, or executive. The constitutional silence in such cases furnishes an occasion for the courts, as the final interpreter of the basic law, to use their discretion to determine which one may validly exercise the power in question. I believe the issue of DAF is one such instance where the court can exercise jurisdiction. Of course you will ask, the Supreme Court has already ruled, it has already exercised its discretion by ruling on DAF. Why can you not accept it? I would like to preface my answer by quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous American jurist whose quotation about the business of law is engraved on the very wall of the UP College of Law, where my late father once taught and where I often hung out as a college student. Justice Holmes said, "The great ordinances of the Constitution do not establish and divide fields of black and white. Even the more specific of them are found to terminate in a penumbra, shading gradually from one extreme to the other. When we come to the fundamental distinctions, it is still more obvious that they must be received with a certain latitude of our government, or our government could not go on." Referring to the division of powers between the legislative and executive branches, Cinco quoted Justice Holmes as saying, "It does not seem to need argument to show that however we may disguise it by vague words, we do not and cannot carry out the distinction between legislative and executive action with mathematical precision and divide the branches into watertight compartments were it ever so desirable to do so, which I am far from believing that it is, or that the Constitution requires." Okay, now let me talk about Article 6, Section 25(5) of the Constitution, which begins by stating that no law shall be passed authorizing any transfer of appropriations. The Supreme Court recently interpreted this to mean that the Constitution absolutely prohibits cross-border transfers among the three branches of government because this violates the separation of powers. My critics have also been quick and furious to point out to me that Aquino's actions violate Congress' power of the purse and, of course, the separation of powers. My question to them is this: if it violates Congress' power of the purse and the separation of powers, which is at the very heart of our democracy, why was Article 6, Section 25(5) never in our 1935 Constitution, which was in operation from 1935 to 1972? Does this mean that our democracy under the 1935 Constitution was less democratic and a violation of the separation of powers? Yes, my fellow students, for I consider myself a student of history and of politics. The prohibition on cross-border transfers was not in our 1935 Constitution. Here is a book published by the University of the Philippines Law Complex comparing all the provisions of the 1935, 1973, and 1987 Constitutions. name your professor?
Season.
Yeah, Carmelo Season. Yeah. Here's the book. I personally know the law professor who did the comparison. Carmelo Season, a constitutional law professor. Page 52 shows that section 25.5 of the 1987 Constitution is identical with section 16.5 of the 1973 Constitution. This is the 1987, this is the 1973, and this is supposed to be the 1935 Constitution. You can see that it's blank. As Supreme Court Justice, Associate Justice Lucas Bersamin rightly pointed out in his ponential ruling on that, the 1973 Constitution explicitly and categorically prohibited the transfer of funds from one item to another, unless Congress enacted a law authorizing the President, the Prime Minister, the Speaker, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the heads of the Constitutional Commissions to transfer funds for the purpose of augmenting any item from savings in another item in the GAA of the respective offices. But what Justice Bersamin did not point out was that the prohibition on cross-border transfers under the 1973 Constitution never became operational, because almost 1 year before the dictator Ferdinand Marcos allowed Batasang Pambansa to convene, Marcos issued Presidential Decree number 1177. I have verified the date when Batasang Pambansa convened by using this book personally given to me by Antonio de Guzman, Secretary of the Batasang Pambansa. PD 1177, which Marcos issued before Batasang Pambansa convened, contained Section 44, which gave Marcos blanket authority to do cross-border transfer of appropriations. In 1987, after Marcos was kicked out and then President Cory Aquino had reconstituted the Supreme Court, the new court struck down this cross-border transfer of the President on appropriation. This is what Professor Robles was referring to as the Demetrio versus Alba case, found in Section 44 of PD 1177. But the same court did not invalidate the entire PD 1177, which happens to contain Section 31, stipulating the automatic appropriations of foreign debt payments. And the court did not also invalidate 3 other sections of PD 1177, which authorized the President to pool and do cross-border transfers of savings for any economic activity that would benefit the nation. So the lawyers who told me that PD 1177 has been repealed had better take a second close look at this law. We still follow the automatic debt appropriation clause to this day. But let's just assume, as Father Joaquin Bernas said, one of the framers of the 1987 Constitution, that those sections allowing cross-border transfers on savings had also been repealed by virtue of the ratification of the 1987 Constitution. Father Bernas wrote a primer on the 1987 Constitution. Here's his primer. On page 201, he posed this question: to what extent may Congress allow transfer of funds? And Father Bernas' reply was, see Section 25.5. From this, we may gather that he did not consider the administrative code that President Cory Aquino enacted into law on July 25, 1987. This is understandable because Father Bernas wrote his primer in March 1987, or 4 months before the administrative code was unveiled by then Executive Secretary Joker Arroyo through Executive Order number 292. Why is this chronology of events important, simply because the administrative code badly lifted sections of PD 1177 in what we now know as sections 38, 39, and 49. This collectively granted the President the power to stop projects, pool savings, and use the pooled savings for cross-border transfers in certain economic activities. Please note that what the Cory-appointed Supreme Court struck down in 1987 was the presidential power to transfer appropriations. The President's power over savings in PD 1177 were kept intact and untouched by the Supreme Court until this DAP ruling came out. To my knowledge, there has been no case where the Supreme Court has ruled on sections 38, 39, and 49 in relation to section 25.5 of the Constitution. And it is for this reason that I wish the court would verify and clarify this aspect. Because if there was such a ruling, Bersamin would have pointed this out in his ponentials. Why do some lawyers not want to define this? Are they embarrassed? Do they feel challenged in their manhood? My reference does not extend to UP law professor and constitutionalist Harry Robles, who also wishes the court to make certain clarifications. In my first piece on that, I have argued that the President's powers in the administrative code were not incompatible with the section 25.5 of the Constitution. So our position seems to be the exact opposite. I said section 25.5 only referred to congressional laws and not to President Cory's law, the administrative code, and that section 25.5 in fact allowed sections 38, 39, and 49 of the administrative code to coexist. People thought I was idiotic, but now, having learned that section 25.5 was not even in our 1935 Constitution, it doesn't seem that idiotic to say that cross-border transfers do not necessarily violate the doctrine of separation of powers. Cross-border transfers were allowed from 1935 to 1972. It took a constitutional convention in 1971 to 72 to try to cure President Marcos' abuse of cross-border transfers. The convention went to the other extreme and barred them altogether. The 1987 Constitutional Commission, several of whose members were also delegates of the 1971 Constitutional Convention, like retired Supreme Court Chief Justice Hilario Davide and Jose Suarez, adopted the 1973 provision barring cross-border transfers of appropriations. I know this because I wrote a 14-part investigative series on the 1972 convention, which I learned later on that my father had lived in their entirety. You know, my mother gave this to me after my father died. I never knew who kept it. This was my series on the 1972 Constitutional Convention. When I wrote this in 1984, I did not know that I was very naive. I thought that it was okay to write it and Marcos would not mind. In any case, I was able to publish it. However, after the 1987 Constitution was ratified, President Aquino enacted, Cory Aquino enacted the Administrative Code, using the legislative powers granted to her by the 87 Constitution's transitory provisions. In that Administrative Code, Section 25.5 of the Constitution was reiterated by cross-border transfers of appropriation. But the same administrative code explained that the President had the power to do cross-border transfer on savings, not appropriations. It's a fine distinction, but a distinction nevertheless, and one that the Supreme Court has to clarify. My critics have gleefully pointed out to me that cross-border transfers violate Section 29(1) of Article 6 of the Constitution, which states that no money shall be paid out of the Treasury except in pursuance of an appropriation made by law. My reply is there are such laws, the Administrative Codes and the General Appropriations Acts. If you look at the recent motion for reconsideration of the executive branch of government, asking the Supreme Court to reverse its ruling, the MR points out that Section 25(5) prohibits the transfer of appropriations, not the transfer of savings. The word appropriations has a very definite meaning in our Constitution. It refers to the GAA, which contains our national budget. But the word savings is not defined at all in the 87 Constitution. Melencio Santa Maria, Dean of the University of the East Institute of Law, pointed this out to me in a recent interview. What are savings? In the court ruling, Justice Disbursement turned to the General Appropriations Act of 2011 and 2012 to look at the definition of savings. And he discovered what I thought was a very interesting thing, and which one of the commenters on my blog, named Vegas, also noted. Justice Disbursement found out that the provisions of the GAA of 2011 and 2012 referring to savings were textually unfaithful to the Constitution for not carrying the phrase for their respective offices. Instead, Disbursement said, the provisions carried a different phrase to augment any item in this act. He then noted the vast implications of these provisions in the two GAAs. He said the effect was that the 2011 and 2012 GAA thereby literally allowed the transfer of funds from savings to augment any item in the GAAs, even if the items belong to an office outside the executive. In other words, the two GAAs allowed cross-border transfers of savings. So not only do you have the Administrative Code, you also have the two GAAs allowing cross-border transfer of savings. And the two GAAs were enacted by the lawmakers, the representatives of the people. Disbursement concluded that the two GAAs contravene the Constitution. It means Congress actually gave the President prior authority to do cross-border transfer of savings in the years 2011 and 2012. But Disbursement said Congress did not have the power to do that. If that is the case, if Congress also violated the Constitution, why did the court zero in on executive officials for reprimand? Why not Congress officials too? That's what I cannot understand. Please recall what American Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said about the power of the legislative and executive branches. The great ordinances of the Constitution do not establish and divide fields of black and white. He said that. And remember also what he also said, we do not and cannot carry out the distinction between legislative and executive action with mathematical precision. I'll skip some parts. The question nobody has answered is, why did Joker and company write these powers into the Administrative Code? Were they idiots? The good senator recently said, Cory Aquino never used it. My answer is, so what? It's still there. And it gives the President awesome powers to do good or to do evil. Surprisingly, Dean Santa Maria told me in the course of my interview with him that Aquino was just testing the limits of the Constitution. If you don't test it, it will always be business as usual. I teased the dean who graduated and once taught at the Ateneo de Manila for decades. Are you saying that you approve of what President Aquino did? I told him that I recalled reading somewhere about the need to have a living constitution. Dean Santa Maria replied to me, it doesn't necessarily mean Aquino is going against the Constitution, but he's in fact expanding the Constitution to new realities and making it exactly a living Constitution that meets day-to-day challenges. I think we have a beautiful Constitution that can accommodate amendments and reinterpretations without mangling its very spirit. To my mind, even the Supreme Court has been reinterpreting the Constitution to meet the challenges of new realities, effectively amending the Constitution. For instance, it upheld the presidency of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo by calling Joseph Estrada's ouster a constructive resignation. It upheld the presence of U.S. military forces without the need for a new treaty by saying no facilities were being built to house them, effectively amending Section 25 of the transitory provisions. In the case of DAP, what also sprung to my mind was comments made by a woman after listening to President Aquino defend DAP. She said, ang naiintindihan ko lang ay ang savings. Anong savings? And she said also, pag walang pera, idilalabas ng ospital at mag-antay na lang ng kamatayan sa bahay. She is relating what is going on with her situation and those of the poor. What is our Constitution for if not to meet the needs of the poor? Article Section 2, Section 9 of the Declaration of Principles and State Policy says, the state shall promote a just and dynamic social order that will ensure the prosperity and independence of the nation and free the people from poverty. The GAA is key to helping free Filipinos from poverty. The only question now is, did the economic stimulus fund actually do that? But that I would leave to the economists. 68 years after our republic was born, 1 out of every 4 Filipinos continue to wallow in poverty. Perhaps the middle and upper classes don't feel this, but to the poor, every day is an emergency. Many years back, I asked the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, what would it take for the Philippines to uplift the poor? He said the rough formula was that the country needed to attain at least 7% GDP growth for 7 years. I thought that was impossible. The last time the Philippines did it, the growth was abruptly cut short by a coup attempt in 1989. And yet, President Arroyo and President Aquino were able to do that in recent years, precisely by juggling government savings, which the Supreme Court has now forbidden. So, we have this dilemma. Surely a mean could be found to curb gross abuse of authority, while at the same time giving any Philippine president wide flexibility to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The ball is in the hands of the Supreme Court, Congress, and the presidency working together. From what I have seen with my own eyes, I would describe the relations among the 3 branches of government as both collaborative and combative. They work together, then they quarrel, then they work together and quarrel again in a never-ending cycle that media men like me gleefully report. Let's not forget also the role of the people for this undertaking to work. We need a genuine Freedom of Information Act to keep a tight watch on the entire budget process. And here, the NCPAG will play a watchdog role. We also need to swiftly jail high government officials, whoever they are, who pocket the people's money or betray the trust.